Okay. On the Titanic, defined but what they wore. Background. On April 10th, 1912, the RMS Titanic left Southampton, England for New York City on its first and only voyage. The Titanic had been called unsinkable and was the most luxurious passenger liner of its day. On April 15th, the ship collided with an iceberg and sank. Over 1,500 people died in the freezing waters. The wreckage was discovered in 1985, but the ship remains on the ocean floor to this day. The Titanic has been immortalized through film, books, television series, songs, exhibits, and in this recent newspaper article. Newspaper article by Guy Treby. Tatters and scraps, they emerged from the deep, coated with mire and miraculously, although tenuously, intact. Treated with the reverence due relics of perhaps the greatest maritime tragedy, and with all the care modern conservation science could summon, they were restored, put on display, and then offered this week in an exceptional single lot auction of more than 5,000 objects, with a current estimated worth of $190 million, that salvagers of the Titanic found scattered across the North Atlantic seabed. A surprising amount of ephemera defied logic to survive the sinking of the unsinkable ocean liner that went to the bottom 100 years ago on April 15th. Most astonishing of all the recovered items, it would seem, were the articles of clothing either carried or worn by passengers before the 882-foot-long liner sank in the icy water. The ship broke apart and shot to the bottom. Its contents fell more slowly, fluttering to the depths like grim leaf fall. And there, in the lightless saline netherworld, a trilby hat, a pair of laced boots, a belted valise, and an alligator bag, along with a huge range of artifacts, lay scattered across a broad apron of remnants. The wreck was discovered in 1985, and the objects were brought to the surface over the course of 7 expeditions. Perhaps more than the teacups of perfume flakens, the garments eerily conjure live lost and the clear April night, and so that when the Academy Award-winning designer Deborah L. Scott prepared to create costumes for James Cameron's blockbuster 1997 film Titanic, she covered her office walls with photographs of the Titanic's passengers to absorb the sartorial elements that enliven characters. The removable celluloid collars with laundry marks inside, the man's vest with a single vertical buttonhole for a watch chain and fob, the homespun finery packed away by village girls as the trousseau for an imaginary future. These sorts of detail were employed by Miss Scott to summon the beings who once inhabited garments that in some cases, though it hard to imagine, survived their owners. Consider, for instance, Marion Manuel's handbag. Using public records, newspaper accounts at the time, and the recollections of survivors, historians like Richard Davenport Hines, author of Voyage of the Titanic, Passengers, Sailors, Shipbuilders, aristocrats, and the worlds they came from, have pieced together fragmentary biographies of victims like Mrs. Meanwell, née Ogden, a British milliner traveling aboard the Titanic on a third-class ticket. As was true of many ocean voyages of the time, Mrs. Meanwell was on a passage intended to be a momentous alteration of a settled life. First character to sail on the liner Majestic, Mrs. Meanwell rebooked on the Titanic after that vessel was removed from regular service. Tucked into her handbag were a number of documents, among them a letter from the London landlords Wheeler Sons and Co. This innocuous note stated blandly that we have always found Meanwell a good tenant and prompt in payment of her rent, carried an extra freight of meaning for an immigrant hoping to build a new life. If you are coming over without credentials or with no prospect of work, Mr. Davenport Hines said, it was not uncommon for examiners of Ellis Island to refuse entry to new arrivals and to send them home as vagrants or tramps. Then, as now, an alligator bag was a luxury item, a satchel of substance carried by a woman whose own social authority it advertised. Mrs. Meanwell was parted from her alligator bag on the night the Titanic sank, and while she perished, her purse did not. Inside it was her marriage license as well as the parents' wedding license, said David Galusha, a conservator for Premier Exhibition, the Atlantic-based company that sold the Titanic relics, along with the video archives of its salvage expeditions and the intellectual rights to create objects using RMS Titanic brand. She had also sold everything, was a widow, and was moving to the United States to be with her daughter, who had 2 children, to assist with them. Mr. Galusha said of Mrs. Meanwell, that the bag survived was owed in part to the fact that the objects scattered from the wreck spent the last century 2 miles down in an environment with no light and hardly any oxygen, the conservator said. There was something else. The thickness of the alligator skin, the quality, is no comparison to what you would find today, Mr. Galusha said. There was a general attitude at the time of making things durable, things that would stand the test of time. That they also did so an unexpectedly moving aspect of a tale so often rehearsed that its human dimensions are sometimes overlooked. Titanic may be, as some claim, one of the most universally recognized names in the English language, yet the lives at the heart of the story are easily forgotten, transformed into facile metaphors and symbols of gender and class. There is the tragic noblesse of the first-class passengers, people named Strauss and Widener and Guggenheim, the hopeless scrambling of the businessmen and boys traveling in second class, some kept at gunpoint from entering lifeboats that went off half-filled, and the wretched doom of the nameless victims at the bottom of the social scale. They were all judged finally on their clothes and the quality of their clothes, Mr. Davenport Hines said, adding that among the aspects of the story most laden with pathos is the contemporary depiction of bodies frozen into life jackets and hauled from the North Atlantic and sorted by class, largely according to what else they had on. Clothes, said Lisa Cohen, a biographer whose book, All We Know, delineates the lives of 3 early modernist women, Mercedes du Acosta, Madge Garland, Esther Murphy, in a part by using the soft history of fashion to demonstrate that our surfaces elucidate our depths, as the author says. The identity masquerade the artist like Cindy Sherman explore to theatrical effect was on prominent view aboard the floating theater of an ocean passage, Miss Cohen said. The Titanic was in that sense a stage prop moving across what was by all accounts a flat and unthreatening ocean, and also across the proscenium of a new century. The Titanic was the stage where people were performing certain versions of themselves for all kinds of audiences, Miss Cohen said. It was a transitional space and a transitional period, a time of self-invention right before the war. Fixed and flattened in memory by the shock of the disaster, the realities of the Titanic became available to nuanced interpretation only now, a century later, just as with the sale of this week of the hats and vests and shoes and watches saved from the ocean come into wider view. It is the power of the surface that's so beautiful here, Miss Cohen said. The smallest detail reveals so much. At a minimum, the sartorial details convey some overlooked information. People were generally smaller in 1912, had tidier heads, more compact torsos, and less capacious lungs. Take the trilby, Mr. Galouche, the conservator said, referring to a felt hat that emerged from conservation in such pristine condition that it could literally be worn right now, although only by a woman with a small head. There's a CSI side of the story, he said. The size of the hat tactically points to shifts in diet over the last century, to the introduction of antibiotics and vitamins. On average, the size of our rib cages increased 4% per generation, Mr. Galouche said, a claim that would go a long way toward explaining why the contemporary bride can't fit into her grandmother's wedding gown. People were frugal in 1912, or anyway less accustomed to the ease of disposable fashion. A patch of invisible weaving can still be detected in a custom-made gentleman's suit recovered from the Titanic wreckage. It was a good suit, and instead of discarding the trousers, the owner would have the hole repaired, Mr. Galouche said. Though they largely passed into legend, those who lost their lives in the epoch-making shipwreck were never characters, said Deborah Nadulaman Landis, the curator of Hollywood Costume, an exhibition exploring the role costume design plays in cinema history that will open in October at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. A character is a pretend person, and real people lost their lives in the wreck of the Titanic, said Miss Landis, an Academy Award nominated designer. On screen, their clothes served as a crucial function as flashcard symbols of social identity. One of the ways you make people feel real in movies is through clothes. People are to a surprising extent what they imagine themselves to be every time they get dressed, Miss Landis said. Our clothing is an amalgam of what we are: the shoes, the vest, the trousers, the suit jacket purchased at different times, she said. Clothes hold us together in so many ways. They're the closest thing to our bodies, our pulse.